Ladies and gentlemen, and now our very first session of the day is a special address by KRI Senior Advisor, Emeritus Professor Dr. Jomo Kwame Sundaram, entitled Recent World Trends and Threats to Malaysian Prospects. Jomo Kwame Sundaram is Senior Advisor, Khazanah Research Institute, Fellow Academy of Science, and Emeritus Professor, University of Malaya. He was UN Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development, Assistant Director General, Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, Founder Chair, International Development Economics Associates, IDEAS, and President, Malaysian Social Science Association. Prof. Jomo has authored and edited over 100 books, written many academic papers, research reports, and media articles, besides translating 12 volumes. He received the 2007 Vasily Leontiev Prize for advancing the frontiers of economic thought. Ladies and gentlemen, also do note that we will be taking questions from the floor via Slido. Kindly do, of course, use the Slido that will be flashed on the screen to key in any questions, which Prof. Dr. Jomo will answer towards the end of this 60-minute session. We'll ideally be allocating roughly 20 minutes for audience Q&A. Professor Jomo, the stage is all yours.
Assalamu alaikum. This plea for peace is not something to be taken for granted these days. We are living in very, very dangerous times, and I'm very appreciative of the invitation from the two organizers of this conference to be here today. Ladies and gentlemen, friends all, we are, as I suggested, living in very dangerous times. And it's important for us to think about some of the changes which we face in the world today, because they, in a very real sense, threaten us existentially. I would like to take this opportunity to speak very directly about some of these challenges. What I'm going to suggest to you is contrary to the received conventional wisdom, and this, I think, demands that we think very seriously and challenge whatever ideas might be offered to you over the next few minutes. I think it's very important for us to recognize that the age which was once termed globalization is largely over. Market access is not open, not available to open economies such as Malaysia in the way it was perhaps in much of the 20th century. Instead, we have a situation of closing market access, as is very evident, for example, by the transition from the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, to the IPS, the Indo-Pacific Strategy of the United States government. Those two are very, very different. TPP offered some market access, and that's part of the reason why it was attractive. IPS does not offer market access. And this is part of the reason why there is a great deal of ambiguity about what it portends. It's important to recognize that the one-size-fits-all commitment of the World Trade Organization is hugely problematic, because you make a commitment to a set of rules which are volumes thick, a very complex set of rules, which are not necessarily sensitive to your needs. This is very different from the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which preceded it, which existed for a long time, which allowed you to pick and choose what was suitable for your needs. It's also important for us to recognize that, contrary to conventional wisdom, just having a free trade agreement is actually not necessarily desirable. As Jagdish Bhagwati, who cannot be accused of not being pro-trade liberalization, has argued, what we have in the form of bilateral agreements as well as plurilateral, including regional trade agreements, are essentially basically they are termites in the system of trade liberalization. They undermine trade liberalization in a fundamental way. And this is something which is often ignored by people who go around pronouncing the virtues of trade liberalization. It's also important, I think, for us to think about the very modest trade liberalization which has actually occurred in the 21st century. In fact, if we look at what has happened, especially from the time of the 2008-2009 global financial crisis, you will find that the global financial crisis created a situation in which the first response of the biggest economies in the world was basically to protect. To protect. And this, I think, is very important for us to recognize. It's not something which has just happened over the last few years or the last few months, but rather a trend which has been taking place arguably since the end of the 20th century. It's also important to recognize that the system of the WTO allows every country theoretically to exercise a veto power. But in fact, it is the US which exercises veto power. Okay? A power which is not available, for example, in the Articles of Agreement of the International Monetary Fund or any other international organization. What this effectively means, for example, is that the dispute settlement mechanism offered by the World Trade Organization has not been able to function for many years because presidents of the United States since Barack Obama have basically stopped appointments to the tribunal. This effectively renders the World Trade Organization's dispute settlement mechanism unviable because you basically don't have a full bench, so to speak, of the judges in any cases involved. So all this basically means that you have a very biased system, which is vulnerable to being jammed up, as we have seen over the last decade or so. And I think it's important for us to recognize that there are huge problems. Add to that what has happened in the last few years. At a time of great need during the COVID-19 pandemic, some of you may are old enough to still remember the late President Mandela, Nelson Mandela. President Mandela's last struggle, I would argue, was a struggle against TRIPS, the trade-related intellectual property rights provisions of the World Trade Organization. What was he fighting for? He was basically fighting for the right of developing countries to respond to public health crisis. And what can be a greater public health crisis than the World Health Organization declaring a pandemic? And yet there was no appropriate response. When developing countries led by South Africa and India proposed a suspension of the intellectual property right rules to allow developing countries to produce their various needs associated with the pandemic, therapies, tests, etc., personal protective equipment, this was disallowed. Okay? It was disallowed. And effectively, it disallowed developing countries from responding to the crisis in appropriate fashion. So I think it's important for us to therefore remember that we are living in very, very hostile times. Now, let me move to something more political, and that is the fact that we are effectively living in times of a new Cold War, where sanctions have become completely legitimized. The powerful countries of the world, in NATO and so on, regularly introduce new sanctions without reference, violating the UN Charter, without reference to any organization in the world other than themselves. And this is tolerated. This is never called out. Have you seen the New York Times or the Times of London or any other editorial, The Economist, for example, questioning this? This is far from happening. What we essentially have now is a situation where rules are there to be exercised against others. Okay? So what is law for? Law is to order others around. That's essentially what we mean now by law and order. So we are living in very, very cynical times. And sanctions, let us remember, are the most ancient type of warfare. You know, you exercise sanctions, it's a form of laying a state of siege on a particular place or particular economy and so on and so forth. So that's essentially what we have in the world today. And so I think it's important for us to remember that it's not only trade sanctions. People often talk very easily of a trade war, but it's also investment sanctions, as we saw with President Trump and then Prime Minister Abe's turn to reshoring. And before that, after that, friendshoring. And this basically means you pick and choose. You extend favors and you withdraw favors. Okay? This is not what most favored status of the World Trade Organization implies. But this is precisely what has happened. Okay? So this basically allows certain powers to disrupt supply chains and to undermine the world economy as it has evolved over the years. So we are living, unfortunately, in very, very difficult times. That's a bit of an understatement, as you can imagine. And we can see what has happened in various areas. Investments, besides trade, of course, technology, even in financial transactions with what has happened with SWIFT and so on. And so basically what we have in the world are major supply-side disruptions. And what we have as a consequence of this is supply-side cost push inflation. This is important for us to remember because the supply-side cost push inflation has basically pushed up fuel, food, and fertilizer prices, among other things. And this has had huge implications. And for some of the poorer countries in the world, we find that there is less and less ODA, Official Development Assistance. Official Development Assistance is less than half the very low target of 0.7 of 1%. Okay, it's less than half. And much of it is increasingly politicized, as we know. Pick and choose. Give ODA to the countries you favor and withdraw ODA from the countries you don't favor. This is the world in which we live. And so what we have as a consequence is a situation where you have greater and greater disorder, supposedly due to market forces. When I was looking at the name of the conference, Malaysia Futures, some of you are old enough to remember there was once something called the CLOF, KL Options and Futures Market. Okay? Malaysian futures were basically defined primarily in terms of palm oil. Okay? It no longer exists. It no longer exists because rather than serving to smoothen prices, as was the original rationale for having futures and options market, what we find is that such markets became means by which you subvert the functioning of markets. You basically are able to corner such markets in ways which basically serve to push up or depress prices as the case might be. And so cloth no longer exists as a consequence. And I think all the better for it. Can you imagine your future being subjected to market forces in such a volatile circumstances? I think we would need to think very seriously, and so I commend the organizers for having a Malaysia Futures discourse, which is not subjected to market forces. Now, let me move on to consider the interest rate hikes. Now, all of you have probably heard at some point or other Mr. Powell, Jerome Powell, the US Fed chair, talking about the necessity of getting down to 2%, the need to get down to 2%. US inflation has not been rising since the middle of last year. Undoubtedly, it rose sharply during the period February to June. But since June last year, US inflation has not gone up. Okay? The inflation rate has not gone up. What does this mean? It means that it is no longer accelerating. Now, for those of you with some acquaintance with conventional macroeconomics, you would have learned that what is of concern is what is called accelerating inflation. Hence, you have the concept of NAIRU, non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. And that is supposed to be what you're concerned about. So when it is not accelerating, why should you be worried? But Mr. Powell, because he's obsessed, he has this fetish with this 2%, decided on to do so. Now, where did this 2% come from? When Professor Kwame was teaching at MIT, he had colleagues, people like, I'm sorry, I'm having many senior moments now. I forgot his colleagues, Rudiger Dornbusch anyway, were arguing that you can have an acceptable modest rate of inflation. What they meant by modest rate of inflation is low double digits. Low double digits inflation was acceptable because it would not undermine growth. And today we have this 2% fetish. Where does it come from? Well, in 1989, I have to tell this story because most economists don't even know where this 2% comes from. Because in 1989, the finance minister of this huge country called New Zealand decided to advise the governor of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand to have a 2% target. 2 by 92. Okay, 89, 92, 3 years, he gave 2 by 92 was the target, was the slogan he created. It sounded good. And that has been the fetish since then. Tan Sri Noor was with the central bank. And at the 50th anniversary conference, Joseph Stiglitz was here and he was challenged by various people from the floor, central bank governors, including Tito Mboweni, who subsequently became the finance minister of South Africa, and a number of other people, because he challenged the 2% target. Now, where did this 2%? What is the economic justification for this? Is there any empirical, let alone theoretical justification for it? I challenge you to find any. But this is the obsession of central bank governors throughout the world. So all this basically implies a contractionary bias of monetary policy, because you are basically trying to keep your inflation down to 2%, regardless of circumstance. And I appreciate Governor Ueda, the new governor of the Central Bank of Japan, who basically said that he has to continue QE, he has to increase QE in Japan to achieve the 2% target. Okay? This is Ueda speaking. But Ueda is the exception which proves the rule. All other central bank governors in the world, the G7 and beyond, basically cite the 2% target as if it was God-given. So I think it's important for us to recognize that there are two fallacies here. One, the 2% target in and of itself, but two, the obsession with inflation when it's not accelerating. It does not hurt. It does not hurt. But what Mr. Powell and the Monetary Policy Committee have done, basically, or the board rather, in the case of the US Fed, has been to depress, not only to increase interest rates, but basically to depress recovery from the pandemic. This is the effect of his policy, because all governments have been forced to respond. Central banks are all tripping over themselves to try to respond to it by raising interest rates, because what they feel they cannot do anything else. They have to do so because there has been a flight of capital. And where did this flight of capital come from? This flight of capital came from the fact that the Article 6 of the Articles of Agreement of the IMF has been violated time and time again, because ever since Michel Camdesou was the managing director of the IMF, the bank has been going around the world telling everybody to open their capital accounts. There is a Malaysian economist from a generation which most people have forgotten, named James Puthucheary. He once said, "This is like opening a bird cage and expecting more birds to fly in than to fly out." Okay? This is the logic of this kind of thinking. Open your capital account and you expect more. And so the late, what's his name, Robert, in another senior moment, the economist who just passed away recently, he talked about capital flowing uphill. Because there's this presumption by economists that if you open up the capital account, capital will flow from the rich economies into the poor economies. And we know that this hasn't happened. It hasn't happened for decades, if not centuries. But this is the belief. It's an article of faith. It is not science. It's what George H.W. Bush used to call voodoo economics. Okay? And you can take your national equivalent if you like, but this is essentially the kind of thinking which animates a lot of people in the world today. So basically, what we have is a situation which systemically is inclined towards economic contraction, is inclined towards stagnation, thanks to the inclinations of the central bank governors. Not based on any kind of science, not based on any kind of empirical trends, for those of you who are more chartist inclined, but rather an article of faith. Now, it's important for us to think also about the other major challenge in the world. I started off by greeting you, peace. And what we have right now is a situation where we have the real threat of war. Real threat of war, because war is no longer something which is happening due to the inability to resolve matters, but because war is being provoked. War is being deliberately provoked time and time and time again. Some of you may know, okay, because it was not a very well-kept secret, that in 2020, okay, there's a young politician here, so he might want to ask his party leaders about this. In 2020, Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State of President Trump, called up and asked Malaysia to agree to joint military patrols. One camp within UMNO was saying that there were over 1,000 incursions by China into Malaysian territorial waters. And depending on how you measure it, yes, there were fishing boats shipping in disputed territories in the South China Sea. Another politician, also from the same party, from UMNO, not your party, argued that no, there were no major incursions by China into the Malaysian territorial waters. The whole idea of having a joint military patrol is to basically create a situation where you can engineer an incident. Remember how the Vietnam War began, the so-called Tonkin Gulf incident. You can manufacture such incidents, and you can have a limited skirmish. Now, the logic in Washington at that time was the following. Mrs. Thatcher won the 1983 election, if I'm not mistaken, from a seemingly impossible situation by going to war with Argentina. Similarly, George W. Bush had won re-election in 2004 precisely by going to war in Iraq, regardless of the fact that there were no weapons of mass destruction or any truth to that. But that's how you win elections and how you win wars. So having a problem with Russia or with Iran was considered too hazardous because you didn't know the kind of weaponry available. So the two places which were being considered were Venezuela or the South China Sea. And we could have been embroiled. We could have been embroiled in a war. And this is precisely why I want to insist that this is a time for us to reaffirm ZOCFAN. The commitment by the leaders, by ASEAN leaders half a century ago to creating a world of, a zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality. And this must not just be neutrality, but it has to be a pacifist neutrality. Because there's no time to be just neutral without being pacifist. Because just being neutral doesn't avoid you getting drawn into other people's wars. You need to be actually actively pacifist. Okay? And this is precisely why we need to think about some of these issues together. These are issues which are not simply economic issues. These are not simply political issues, and so on and so forth. It is precisely for this reason that it's important for us to consider what increasingly is referred to as geopolitics. Geography doesn't seem to be such a constraint, with all due respect to the geographers among us, because when the United Kingdom built two aircraft carriers, the Queen Elizabeth II and the Prince of Wales, where did they deploy one of those two carriers? To protect UK territorial waters? No. Where did they deploy it? Well, just in case you didn't know, they're supposed to be in this part of the world protecting all of us. Who asked them to come? In the mid-1960s, there are very few of you who will still remember, but in the mid-1960s, I think it was, I can't remember the name of the Prime Minister, the UK Prime Minister, who announced a withdrawal east of Suez. Okay? And this was supposed to threaten the Royal Navy's shipyard in Singapore, and it was going to be war and so on and so forth. So the challenge for Singapore, for example, was to rebuild that and so on and so forth. Now, what happened, as you know, was that the UK, for circumstances, I mean the end of empire and so on, basically couldn't afford it. Let us not forget that Peninsular Malaysia contributed 70% of the foreign exchange needs of the entire British Empire in the half decade after World War II. Okay? 70%. It's a matter of public record, it's no big secret. And that was the significance of Malaya. Okay? The so-called emergency was not stakeless. They had a tremendous stake. That's why it was called an emergency, because you didn't want to declare war, because insurance policies would not operate during war. And so I think it's important for us to begin to recognize the intimate relationships between politics and the economy, and how our fate is held so in such ways, in such very dangerous ways at this moment. So what we have right now is a combination of forces, a combination of the depressive contractionary effects of monetary policy, which are great reversal from the earlier policy of QE and so-called unconventional monetary policies of the preceding decade or more, to this current situation, which is slowing down the world economy. Not because anybody wants it, but because of a fetish, of a 2% fetish held by the US Fed chair, this current chair, and a range of others. I want to emphasize that the vice chair, for example, has been calling for months for reversing this trend. But the vice chair is not important in the US Fed system, and so, she has been overruled. Okay? So we have a situation which is extremely dangerous, driving the world into stagnation when it is barely trying to recover from the pandemic, and To compound it, the diversion of very scarce fiscal resources available from rebuilding post-pandemic, from the Sustainable Development Goals, instead going to military and other so-called strategic purposes. This is the threat we face in the world today. I've been told to speed up, and so I shall try to speed up. The US policies are basically causing a depression because it is that combination of circumstances. But very importantly, even those elements of public spending which remain are being diverted increasingly for purposes which have little to do with improving the human condition, with improving human welfare. This is the danger which we face in the world today. And so I think it's important for us to begin to recognize how we need to address these issues holistically. At the same time, I think we need to recognize that we have, even before the period of so-called globalization, even before that, Malaya and after that, Malaysia has been a very open economy. You cut yourself off from the rest of the world. It's like cutting your nose off to spite your face. So what does it mean? And it's precisely for that reason that I urge a policy of calling for pacifist non-alignment. Okay. Now, we also have a situation where we have protracted stagnation since the global financial crisis, for reasons which you all should be familiar with. As soon as there were so-called green buds of recovery after the global financial crisis, the fiscal efforts were cut off immediately. Why? Because professional economists who should have known better were sounding alarms, bells of alarm. My old friend Ken Rogoff and Carmen Reinhardt and the late Alberto Alesina, all of whom were associated with Harvard, were all calling for this, for cutting off, for reversing because of the threat of greater debt. Well, what happened instead? There was QE, much more money available, and seemingly affordable debt. All that has been reversed in the last 1 year. The cost of debt is very high, and we are not just talking about public debt, we're talking about household debt. So this will hurt people all over the world in very profound ways. It's not just governments suffering under the weight of sovereign debt, but it also forces us, especially in Malaysia, to have a proper accounting, and we need the checks and balances of sovereign debt. We have saw how sovereign debt, the country went into sovereign debt so easily with very, very few checks and balances. But very few Malaysians know that in addition to the official government debt, which is bad enough, there's another amount which is about half of that official debt, which is called government guaranteed borrowings. And government guaranteed borrowings basically involve losses. And I just want to highlight two things. One, which is now well known, of course, is 1MDB, a lot of borrowing to finance 1MDB. And the other, which unfortunately I failed to stop, is ECRL. Now, I happen to have been a failed engineering student. So instead of doing engineering, I ended up being an economist, the fate of everybody who fails as an engineer. But more seriously, what basically happened is that you have a situation where the sorry, you have a situation where the finances of the, the cost of the ECRL. My engineering friends would tell me privately that a maximum cost of the ECRL would have been 20 billion. If you really pressed very hard, it would cost 17 billion. When the contract was signed at the end of 2017, it involved, the estimated cost had gone up to 81 billion. Okay, from 17 billion to 81 billion. Okay. Now, and because the first 7 years you didn't need to repay, the interest would accumulate and you would eventually end up paying about 110 billion. Okay, that would have been the total burden of the ECRL. Now, as you know, it was subsequently revised rather than cancelled, and so we went down to something about 20% less, but you still have this essentially white elephant, okay, which would basically be built, which is not going to bring us very much in terms of income. So all this debt does not even go to the Public Accounts Committee. I don't know whether our young MP is a member of the Public Accounts Committee, but the Public Accounts Committee doesn't even look at it, because this is not considered government debt. It's government guaranteed debt. And this is extremely dangerous. And this doesn't happen just in Malaysia, it happens in many, many other countries as well. So we are so heavily indebted that you know, it really boggles the mind. And there's very little accounting. I still remember Khalid Ibrahim at that time with PNB doing and trying to identify the number of public enterprises in the mid-1980s. Okay? He couldn't even identify how many, there were over 1,000. He had a tough time trying to find all the public enterprises which had already been created. Today, you would have a very tough time finding the government guaranteed debts which have already been incurred. Okay? But the current estimate is about half of the total sovereign debt. So this is huge. This is huge and didn't begin yesterday. It didn't begin with this government. It didn't begin with the previous government. It has been accumulated over the years and tolerated for partly by ignorance. Most people don't even realize this. So I think it's important for us to begin to realize how vulnerable this country is. Okay? I don't want to sound alarmist, and it's precisely for this reason that I think it's very important at a time when public confidence is important, that we think about these issues without being alarmist about these issues. But I want to emphasize that there is a threat of a deepening stagnation. Up to about a year ago, or even more, I was warning about the likelihood of stagflation because of the sharp rise of prices in the second quarter of 2022. I no longer believe that there is a threat of galloping inflation, which I feared to be the case at that time. And so my concern is really with stagnation rather than with stagflation today. Because my concerns about stagflation were wrongly used to argue against a stronger role and stronger responsibility of government in responding to this situation. As I said, let me just run through this slide. You can scan this slide with your own eyes because I'm running out of time. But I think it's very important for us to recognize that we now live in a world of what has been called a new non-alignment, and that we live in a world of a of essentially a new Cold War, and I don't want to rehearse all these arguments. They're all quite familiar with you. And just in case many of you were thinking that, well, the US is the problem, and so on and so forth, it's actually more than the US. And I refer you to this slide from Mr. Josep Borrell. He's the High Commissioner for the European Union, the High Representative, of the European Union. He's a Vice President. And basically, he considers Europe a garden and us threats to the garden. And he's basically saying that you don't wait until those threats enter your garden. You have to go out and address them. And this becomes the justification for aggressive actions by Europe as well. So we are living in very, very difficult times. I'm not urging for one moment an anti-Western turn. I'm urging non-alignment. Okay? I don't have time to go through the arguments for that because I've almost run out of time, but let me just quickly go through a few graphs with you just to indicate how wrongly often we are influenced. Firstly, all too many Malaysians in the middle class especially are obsessed with the composite KLCI. This is hardly any serious financial economist should tell you that the stock market composite index is not an indication of how an economy is faring. But unfortunately, this has become a surrogate, a convenient surrogate for all too many people. Instead, if we look at growth, the growth record has been quite modest in the last quarter century. Ever since 1997, it has been quite modest. But we cannot reproduce the conditions of that period, and we really have to move on. And that's why many of the discussions going to take place over the next day and a half are extremely important, because they compel us to think about how the world has changed. We cannot be fighting the wars of yesteryear. The world has moved on. We have to move on. Now, just a quick reminder on setbacks which Malaysia has experienced in terms of growth at various times, and some indications about trade growth. But remember that trade growth figures are very, very misleading, because what are you measuring? Okay? You're measuring essentially at market values, and market values do not necessarily indicate the amount you are trading. But very importantly, I think it's important to recognize, as far as non-alignment is concerned, and yet another very pragmatic reason for considering non-alignment, and that is the fact that who are we trading with? Our number one trading partner, besides the obvious ones like Singapore, where it's often we are not really exporting to Singapore, but we are exporting through Singapore, is the fact that China is the number one trading partner of all ASEAN countries. You don't want to get into a fight with China either. You don't want to fight with the US on the one side and with China on the other. Okay? Rather, it's important for us to be very creative in terms of our active non-alignment. Inflation numbers, I won't comment on them, and unemployment figures. Okay. Yet, I would say, despite these unemployment figures, I think it's important to recognize that Malaysia is not a basket case as far as unemployment is concerned. You have full employment in the US, thanks to the policies of Obama, Trump, and Biden in terms of keeping full employment going. You have full employment perhaps in Singapore, and you have close to full employment here. In fact, our problem is that we do not even recognize and consider how significant foreign labor is in this country. The fact that 1/4 of the actual labor force in this country is not even documented. 1/3 of the labor force is foreign. And only 1/3 of the foreign labor force is documented. So we need to begin to think about these things as we move on. And I just want to urge you to consider all these things as we try to influence the course of our nation in these very, very difficult and complex times. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Prof. Jomo. Timely insights as always. And now, ladies and gentlemen, of course, we have received a couple of questions from all of you via Slido. Thanks so much. We will be going into the first of those questions. Prof. Jomo, Anonymous asked, given trade pressures, is it feasible for Malaysia, a small country with limited influence, to push for Zopfan? If so, how? Seems very ideal.
I think pushing for Zopfan is a bit of an easy thing to do. We need to set our sights higher because Zopfan already exists. That's the joint declaration of ASEAN, almost a raison d'etre for the existence of ASEAN. We don't really need to do very much. Everybody pretends, at least, that they are committed to Zopfan, every member of ASEAN. So I don't think that that's a very difficult call. And calling for Zopfan does not, nobody is going to get terribly upset if you call for Zopfan. It's the pacifism which is the much more complex and challenging challenge for us. And there, of course, what does pacifism mean? Do you allow nuclear submarines to run through the Straits of Malacca, for example? Do you allow nuclear-powered ships to dock in Malaysian ports, as happens elsewhere in this region? These are important challenges for us, and but calling for Zopfan in and of itself is not a problem.
Thank you very much. The next question from Anonymous as well. To what extent would this reversion of globalization negatively affect Malaysia, and what policies should Malaysia undertake?
I don't have a simple prescription on what Malaysia should undertake. I think it would be hazardous to be protectionist in Malaysia. It doesn't make sense. Okay, it doesn't make sense. I know some of my friends will say, you want to continue to be dependent on the world economy, etc., etc. Well, so be it. But I do think that it is important for Malaysia, and where Malaysia and Southeast Asia is different from Northeast Asia, is that Northeast Asian industrialization has been largely undertaken by their own national companies. Okay? Southeast Asian industrialization has been so heavily dependent on foreign direct investment. Okay? I'm not saying that we block foreign direct investment. That would be, again, stupid. But let us remember that there are relatively easy things which could have been achieved. Consider, for example, the fact that Malaysia is now the second largest producer of photovoltaic solar panels, together with Korea. The number one is China. China can barely export its photovoltaic solar panels. Korea doesn't export its photovoltaic solar panels because they are generally more expensive. So Malaysia is the number one exporter of photovoltaic solar panels. But how many Malaysian companies are there producing solar panels? One major company. Okay? Only one major company. Others are all foreign companies here. Now consider how difficult it is to make a photovoltaic solar panel. The technology has more or less remained unchanged for almost 3 decades now, since the middle of the 1990s. There have been improvements, undoubtedly, in design and so on and so forth, but the basic technology has remained unchanged. It's not even subject to IP. It's something which could easily have been acquired. How many components are there? Less than 200. Compare that with proton, 4,000 components. Okay? So this would have been an easy win if we had been much more committed. Take another problem. And I'm deliberately choosing two which would be considered green industries. Biodiesel. Malaysia produces, together with Indonesia and a number of other countries, Malaysia is the second largest producer, at least for the time being, of palm oil. 4 decades ago, from next to nothing, Malaysia developed the most efficient palm oil refining industry in the world. How? By learning and doing. That is the real Malaysian success story. Not this electronics, where Malaysians hardly play a role in it except doing a bit of assembly and so on. Palm oil refining was the real Malaysian success story of the 70s and 80s. Despite being blocked by Europe. Europe refused to allow palm oil to come in. And Malaysian government at that time responded to its tariff escalation by export duty escalation. But even then, it couldn't succeed. But in those times, it was because of the uncertainty of the international monetary non-system after Nixon pulled out in 1971, you had a situation where there was a lot of what is wrongly called barter trade. Okay? So Malaysia made deals with India. Why do we eat beef from India? It's a healthier beef, by the way, because it's buffalo beef rather than cattle beef. But why do we eat beef from India if you're a beef eater? Because of the deal made at that time. Another deal was made with the Soviet Union, and another deal was made with Pakistan. And a fourth deal was made with China. Palm oil did not suit up the ceilings of small Chinese apartments, became very, very popular. Okay? Now, all that was possible, but this is a different time and age where you cannot rely on those types of arrangements anymore. And so we need to begin to think about how to adapt to these new circumstances. So I think it's important for us to recognize that proactive measures have been taken. Malaysia has been very successful in technological upgrading of its own when it has really tried. But it has not really tried. Those of you who are old enough will still remember Tan Sri Augustine Ong and Tan Sri Yusof Basiron talking about palm oil biodiesel way back in the 1980s. And what has happened? Indonesia is leading the way. Now, if a breakthrough could be made with Europe, it would change the world. Because together, Southeast Asia with West Africa would produce much of the palm oil in the world, which would offer the cheapest biodiesel for Europe. Because in 2006, as the US went with bioethanol, Europe went for biodiesel. Okay, those are just two things, but there are many other examples which could be found, which are important for us to consider. But ultimately, I do think one big area, and my colleagues in KRI are working on this, is the huge question of improving the nutrition of Malaysians. We are not at the stage of whether we have enough rice to eat. You know, Malaysia is in a different category. There are many people in the world who just do not have enough calories, enough joules. Okay? But as far as Malaysia is concerned, we need to eat better. We cannot condemn people to eating food full of toxic pesticides, which is unfortunately the case right now. When do we hear that there are too many toxic pesticides in our vegetables? Only when the vegetables are blocked from entering Singapore. That should not be the case. We should prioritize the welfare, the well-being of Malaysians. And this, I think, is extremely important.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, Prof. Jomo. We wish we had more time to go into the many, many questions that have come in. Audience members, you can, of course, catch up with Prof while he will be with us for some part of the day. On that note, could I kindly ask you to remain on stage briefly, Prof? I would now like to invite Professor Dr. Hyun Bang Shin, Professor of Geography and Urban Studies, LSE, and Director of the Saw Swee Hock Southeast Asia Center, or SEAC, at LSE, to present Professor Jomo with a small token of appreciation, followed by a quick photograph. Thank you very much once again, Prof. Jomo, for that excellent presentation and answering all those insightful questions from the audience. And thank you also to Professor Dr. Shin for officiating the small token giving ceremony.